I thought my life was perfect. A successful business, a beautiful wife, and a son I trusted more than anyone. But everything I believed in was a lie. On a quiet beach, I stumbled upon a betrayal so shocking, it shattered my world forever. This isn't just a story about heartbreak, it's about uncovering deception, fighting back, and reclaiming what's mine. You won't believe how this ends. I never thought I'd be the guy pouring his heart out on the internet, but I feel like my life has turned into some kind of dark soap opera. Let me give you some background so you can understand where I'm coming from. My name is Mark, and I'm 45. I've been married to my wife, Jessica, for 6 years now. Jessica is 32, stunningly beautiful, sharp as a whip, and incredibly charming. She has this magnetic personality that just pulls people in. When we first met, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was everything I'd ever dreamed of in a partner. Little did I know, beauty and charm can sometimes hide treachery. This wasn't my first marriage. I have a son, Tyler, from my first marriage. He's 24, ambitious, and charismatic in his own right. Tyler and I always had a strong bond despite the complications of divorce and growing up in separate households. Over the years, I was proud to bring him into the family business, an advertising agency I built from the ground up. It was my legacy, something I thought I could pass down to him and Jessica as a team. Jessica and Tyler seemed to get along well, almost too well in hindsight. I'd chalked it up to their shared passion for the business. We were a family, a unit I trusted completely. But now I wonder if I was blind, or just foolishly naive. Looking back, the signs were there, but they were subtle. Jessica started volunteering for more business trips with Tyler. They'd brainstorm campaigns late into the night. I was too busy managing clients and operations to think much of it. She'd always reassure me with a kiss and a smile, "Mark, you're the rock of this family. I just want to do my part." How could I have known that her part included something so disgusting, so utterly devastating? The first crack in my world appeared last month when Jessica accidentally left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping, honestly, I'd never felt the need to, but a message popped up from Tyler that caught my eye. It was a simple text, "Last night was incredible. Can't wait until we're alone again." My stomach dropped. At first, I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Maybe they were talking about a business deal or a client dinner. But deep down, I felt the stirrings of doubt. My mind started piecing together little details, Jessica's sudden interest in fitness, her new lingerie, Tyler's increasingly essential role on every project she took on. I dismissed it. I had to. After all, this was my wife and my son. After seeing that message, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself I was overthinking, maybe even misinterpreting it. But no matter how hard I tried, the words kept echoing in my head, "Last night was incredible." Jessica returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, humming to herself like nothing was wrong. She gave me a kiss on the cheek and asked if I wanted eggs or pancakes for breakfast. I felt a lump in my throat as I forced a smile and told her pancakes were fine. It was like everything had shifted in that moment. My trust, my comfort, the very foundation of my marriage. Yet, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. That day at work, I found myself watching them more closely. Jessica and Tyler were both in the office, heads together over some new campaign. They laughed at an inside joke, their faces close enough to make my stomach churn. Was this how they always were? Had I been too blinded by my trust to notice? I tried to focus on my own tasks, but my mind kept drifting. I started replaying little moments in my head, times when Jessica would text Tyler late at night, their shared enthusiasm for working weekends, and the way she always seemed to light up when he entered the room. Before, I'd chalked it up to their shared passion for the business. Now, I wasn't so sure. That evening, I decided to test the waters. While Jessica was in the shower, I casually scrolled through her phone again. I didn't find any incriminating messages, but she had deleted her recent texts. All of them. My heart sank. Jessica never deleted anything. She was the kind of person who'd keep old grocery lists and receipts in her phone for months. The sudden cleanliness of her messages screamed guilt. I didn't say anything to her that night. Instead, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside me. A storm of doubt and paranoia was building inside me, and I had no idea how to handle it. The next morning, she announced that she and Tyler would be heading out of town for a business trip. They were meeting a client in Florida, someone I'd worked with briefly in the past. Jessica was unusually enthusiastic, even for her. This could be a game changer for us, she said, her eyes sparkling. I forced a smile and nodded. Sounds great. Let me know how it goes. Inside, I was screaming. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I decided to let them go on the trip and see what unfolded. I had no idea just how horrifying the truth would be. After Jessica and Tyler left for their business trip, I spent the first day trying to focus on work. I buried myself in client emails, campaign proposals, and financial reports, hoping to drown out the nagging voice in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the unease. The office felt emptier without them, but instead of comfort, it only made me feel more suspicious. I started replaying the last few weeks in my mind, combing through every interaction for clues. Jessica had been more distant lately, claiming she was stressed about work. Tyler, who normally confided in me about everything, had also been unusually quiet. When they talked about this trip, they were almost too excited, like it wasn't just about business. I decided to take a walk during lunch to clear my head, but instead of relaxing, my thoughts spiraled further. I hated myself for even thinking this way. Jessica was my wife, and Tyler was my son. They were family. These kinds of suspicions felt wrong, even shameful. But the nagging voice wouldn't go away. What if you're right? That evening, as I sat alone in our quiet house, I poured myself a drink and opened my laptop. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe proof, maybe reassurance. I pulled up the agency's shared calendar, where Jessica had logged all their meetings for the trip. Everything seemed normal: client lunches, brainstorming sessions, and a dinner with the client's executive team. But then I noticed something odd. Their schedule was packed during the day, but the evenings were unusually free. Jessica usually filled every minute of her trips with networking and meetings. I clicked on the hotel reservation she'd shared with me, confirming they were staying at a beachside resort, a luxury Jessica had justified as making the right impression on the client. My hands trembled as I opened Google Maps and looked up the resort. Pictures of white sand beaches, crystal clear water, and romantic cabanas filled the screen. My stomach twisted into knots. Was this really about work? Or was it an excuse to play out some sick fantasy? I couldn't stop myself. I logged into the agency's travel account and checked their flight details. They'd flown out together, sitting side by side in first class. Tyler had always flown economy on business trips before, saying he didn't want to waste company money. So why the sudden upgrade? The more I looked, the more the little inconsistencies piled up, each one adding to the growing weight on my chest. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But the doubts wouldn't go away. I thought about calling Jessica, but what would I even say? Hey, just checking in to see if you're sleeping with my son. The next morning, I decided I couldn't sit around waiting anymore. I told myself I'd surprise them, show up at the resort unannounced. It wasn't just about catching them in the act. I told myself I wanted to share some good news about the agency. I just finalized a major contract with a client we'd been courting for months, and it was the kind of deal that could secure our future for years. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. I booked a last-minute flight to Florida and packed a small bag. As I drove to the airport, I couldn't shake the mixture of dread and anger swirling inside me. If I was wrong, I'd feel like the world's biggest idiot. But if I was right? The flight felt endless. I stared out the window, my mind racing with every possibility. What if I found them laughing over dinner, just colleagues celebrating a successful day? What if I found nothing at all, and my suspicions were just the product of an overworked, overthinking mind? But then there was the other possibility. The one I couldn't even bring myself to say out loud. By the time I landed in Florida, it was late afternoon. I rented a car and drove to the resort, my heart pounding the entire way. When I arrived, I parked in the far corner of the lot, out of sight, and made my way toward the beach. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when I saw them. Jessica and Tyler were standing near the water, their silhouettes outlined by the fading light. At first, it looked innocent, just two people talking. But as I crept closer, staying hidden behind a row of palm trees, I saw Jessica place her hand on Tyler's chest. She leaned in, and before I could process what was happening, they were kissing. Not a quick peck or a friendly gesture, but a full, passionate kiss that left no room for doubt. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body went numb. It felt like the world had stopped spinning, like everything I'd built, everything I believed in, had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to scream, to run out and confront them, to demand an explanation. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching the scene unfold like some kind of twisted nightmare. Eventually, they pulled apart, laughing softly as they walked back toward the resort. I stayed hidden until they were out of sight, my mind reeling. The truth was undeniable now, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Should I wait until we were back home? Or should I just walk away from everything, my marriage, my business, my son, and try to start over? I felt like a stranger in my own life, a man who had trusted too much and been betrayed in the worst possible way. I stayed there on the beach long after they were gone, staring at the waves as they rolled in, trying to make sense of it all. What the hell was I supposed to do now? I didn't go back to the resort that night. I couldn't. Instead, I checked into a small motel down the road. The room was cramped, the bed lumpy, and the air conditioning barely worked, but I didn't care. I needed to be alone to think about my next move. I spent the night replaying the scene on the beach over and over again in my head, every detail burned into my memory. Jessica's hand on Tyler's chest. The way she looked at him, the way he looked at her. That kiss. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. It was deliberate, intimate, and real. My wife. My son. I wanted to scream, to break something, but instead, I just sat there in the dark, trying to piece together how my life had come to this. The woman I loved and the son I'd raised had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And yet, I still didn't know how to confront them. The next morning, I decided I couldn't let this go on any longer. They were expecting me to be back home, blissfully unaware of their betrayal. But I was here, and I needed answers. I drove back to the resort, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with what I would say, how I would confront them. Would I catch them off guard? Would Jessica try to deny it, or would she finally tell me the truth? When I arrived, I walked through the grand lobby, the opulence of the place making me feel even more out of place. I asked the receptionist to connect me to Jessica's room, but she said they were down at the beachside lounge. Of course, they were. As I made my way outside, I spotted them almost immediately. They were sitting at a small table under a sun umbrella, laughing and sipping cocktails like they didn't have a care in the world. It made my stomach churn. How could they be so carefree after what they'd done? I walked straight up to their table, my shadow falling over them before they even noticed me. Jessica's eyes widened in shock, and Tyler froze, his hand halfway to his drink. "Mark?" Jessica stammered, her voice high-pitched and nervous. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, staring at them, letting the silence grow until it was unbearable. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and trembling with barely contained anger. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my eyes boring into hers. "Or maybe I should ask why you were kissing my son on the beach last night." Jessica's face turned pale, and Tyler looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Neither of them said anything, the guilt written all over their faces. "Well?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Are you going to deny it? Or are you finally going to tell me the truth?" Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tyler, of all people, was the first to speak. "Dad, I can explain," he said, his voice shaking. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped, the anger I'd been holding back finally spilling out. "I saw you, Tyler. I saw you and Jessica kissing. So, tell me, what exactly am I supposed to think?" Jessica finally found her voice. "Mark, please, let's talk about this privately," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. I jerked away from her touch like it burned. "Don't you dare try to spin this, Jessica. I trusted you. I trusted both of you. And this is what you do behind my back." She looked like she was about to cry, but I didn't care. I didn't feel sympathy, only rage and heartbreak. Tyler tried again. "Dad, it's complicated." "Complicated?" I interrupted, my voice echoing louder than I intended. A few people at nearby tables were starting to glance our way. "You're my son. She's my wife. It doesn't get much simpler than that." Jessica finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. "Mark, I'm sorry," she sobbed. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "What, you tripped and accidentally fell into his arms?" I couldn't take it anymore. The sight of them, the lies, the betrayal, it was too much. I turned and walked away, ignoring Jessica's desperate pleas for me to come back. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't stand to be near them a second longer. As I left the resort, I felt the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. My marriage, my family, my business, it was all a lie. And now, I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. I drove aimlessly after storming out of the resort. My head was pounding, my chest tight, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I replayed the confrontation over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every look, every excuse they tried to give. It was as if I were watching someone else's life fall apart, not my own. Eventually, I ended up back at the motel. I collapsed onto the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling. What was I supposed to do now? Jessica and Tyler had betrayed me, but this wasn't just about my marriage. Tyler wasn't just my son, he was my business partner, my legacy. The advertising agency I'd built over decades was as much his as it was mine. And Jessica, she'd embedded herself into every corner of my life, both personal and professional. Untangling this mess felt impossible. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept picturing Jessica's tears, Tyler's stammered excuses, and the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. It was sickening. How long had this been going on? How many trips, how many nights had they spent together while I was back home, trusting them completely? By morning, I knew I couldn't leave things unresolved. I needed to confront them again, to get the answers they hadn't given me the day before. But I also needed a plan. The thought of walking away from everything, the agency, the family I thought I had, was terrifying. But staying and pretending like nothing had happened was impossible. I returned to the resort mid-morning, half hoping they'd already checked out. No such luck. Their rental car was still parked outside, and when I asked the receptionist, she confirmed they were in their room. I knocked on their door, the sound echoing down the quiet hallway. For a moment, I thought they wouldn't answer. But then the door opened, and Jessica stood there, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." I pushed past her into the room, where Tyler was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his face a mixture of shame and fear. "You both owe me an explanation," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Start talking." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jessica broke the silence. "Mark, I don't even know where to begin. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just did." I laughed bitterly. "That's the best you've got? It just happened. Do you think that's going to make me feel better?" Tyler finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" I snapped, turning to him. "You knew what this would do to me, to our family, and you still went through with it. Why?" He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know," he said weakly. It got out of hand." "Out of hand?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're my son, Tyler. She's my wife. This isn't some office romance or a mistake you can brush off. This is a betrayal on every level." Jessica started crying again, but I didn't care. I was done feeling sympathy for her. "How long?" I demanded. "How long has this been going on?" Jessica hesitated, glancing at Tyler before answering. "A few months," she admitted quietly. "It started during that trip to Chicago. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut." Chicago. That was months ago. While I was back home, trusting them to represent our agency, they were. I shook my head, trying to process it. "So every trip, every late night you spent together, every time you looked me in the eye and lied, it's all been part of this?" "Mark, it wasn't like that," Jessica said, her voice desperate. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice cracking. "You both did." The room fell silent, the weight of their betrayal hanging heavy in the air. I looked at them, the people I thought I knew better than anyone, and felt like I was staring at strangers. "I trusted you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you. And this. This is how you repay me." Jessica reached out as if to comfort me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said sharply. "You don't get to play the victim here. Not after what you've done." I turned to Tyler, who still couldn't meet my gaze. "And you were supposed to be my son, my partner. I raised you, taught you everything I know. And this is how you repay me?" He didn't answer, just hung his head in shame. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I need time to think," I said finally. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but one thing's for sure, things will never go back to the way they were." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and an emptiness I couldn't even begin to describe. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After leaving their room, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the dashboard. The confrontation had left me drained, but it also brought a strange kind of clarity. The life I thought I had, a loving wife, a loyal son, a thriving family business, was gone. In its place was a mess I needed to untangle, starting with the agency. If I let my emotions take over, I'd risk losing everything I'd worked for. By the time I got back to the motel, I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of one. I couldn't confront this betrayal head-on, not yet. I needed time to protect myself, to ensure I wasn't blindsided by whatever fallout was coming. Jessica and Tyler had already destroyed my trust, I wasn't about to let them destroy my business, too. The next morning, I called our lawyer, Emily. Emily had been with me since the early days of the agency, and she was one of the few people I trusted implicitly. I didn't give her the full story, just enough to make her understand the urgency. "Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to review the agency's bylaws and partnership agreements. Specifically, I want to know what happens if one of the partners breaches trust or acts against the company's interests." She paused, sensing the tension in my voice. "Mark, is everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "But I can't get into it right now. Just look into it for me, please." "Of course," she said. "I'll have something for you by tomorrow." After hanging up, I felt a small sense of relief. At least I was taking steps to protect the agency. It was the one thing I couldn't let Jessica and Tyler take from me, no matter what. That evening, I went through the agency's financial records. I wanted to make sure everything was in order, no hidden expenses, no unexplained withdrawals. As I combed through the numbers, my paranoia grew. Every expense report Tyler and Jessica had submitted felt like potential evidence of their betrayal. Were those expensive dinners really for clients? Or were they using company money to fund their affair? It didn't take long to find something suspicious. A series of charges from a high-end jewelry store caught my attention. The purchases were listed under Jessica's expense account, but they weren't gifts for me, I would have remembered that. My hands shook as I scrolled through the details. A necklace, a bracelet, a watch, all expensive, all bought within the last 6 months. I couldn't prove they were for Tyler, but I didn't need to. The timing, the amounts, the secrecy, it all pointed to one conclusion. They'd been using the agency as their personal piggy bank, and I was too blind to see it. By the time I finished, my anger had turned into a cold, simmering determination. This wasn't just about my marriage or my family anymore. Jessica and Tyler had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let them walk away without consequences. The next morning, I met with Emily in her office. She'd pulled together a detailed analysis of the agency's bylaws and partnership agreements. As she went over the documents, I focused on the sections about breach of trust and fiduciary responsibility. "Based on what you've told me," Emily said, "if one of the partners has acted against the company's interests, you have grounds to remove them from their position. But you'd need evidence to prove it." I nodded, my mind already racing. "What about ownership shares? Can I force them to sell?" "It depends on the circumstances," she said. "If you can prove financial misconduct or a breach of duty, you'd have a strong case. But it would take time, and it wouldn't be pretty." Pretty wasn't what I was aiming for. Justice was. Before leaving Emily's office, I asked her to start drafting the necessary documents. "I don't want them to see this coming," I said. "When the time is right, I want everything ready to go." Emily gave me a sympathetic look. "Mark, whatever's going on, I'm here to help. Just be careful. These kinds of situations can get messy." Messy was an understatement. As I drove back to the motel, I thought about how much my life had changed in just a few days. The wife I loved, the son I raised, the family I thought I had, it was all gone. But if they thought I was going to roll over and let them take everything from me, they were wrong. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure they regretted ever betraying me. The next few days were a blur of planning and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them on the beach, laughing, kissing, acting like they hadn't shattered my world. But instead of letting the rage consume me, I used it. Anger gave me focus. It made me sharper. I wasn't just going to confront them, I was going to dismantle the lies they'd built, piece by piece. My first priority was gathering evidence. Emily was clear, if I wanted to remove them from the business, I needed proof of their misconduct. Financial records were a start, but I needed more. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be explained away. Jessica had always been meticulous about her phone and laptop, but Tyler? He was careless. I knew his habits well enough to guess his laptop password, and I was right, it took me less than 10 minutes to get in. At first, I found nothing incriminating, just a jumble of work files and personal photos. But then I stumbled upon a folder buried deep in his documents, hidden under a generic name, Meeting Notes. My heart pounded as I clicked it open. Inside were dozens of photos, texts, and emails, all of them detailing his affair with Jessica. There were pictures of them together at hotels, holding hands at dinners, even selfies of them on the beach. The texts were worse. They were explicit, describing their nights together in vivid detail. My stomach churned as I read them, but I forced myself to keep going. The emails were the final nail in the coffin. They weren't just about their relationship, they included plans to use company funds for their trips, expensive dinners, and gifts. It wasn't just an affair. It was theft. I downloaded everything onto a USB drive, my hands trembling with a mix of disgust and determination. This was it, the evidence I needed to protect the agency, to protect myself. But even with the proof in my hands, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about money. It was personal. Later that day, I met with Emily again, laying the USB drive on her desk. "This is what you need," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Start the process to remove them. Both of them." Emily looked at me with concern. "Mark, are you sure? This isn't just a legal battle. It's going to get ugly." "I don't care," I said. "They made their choices. Now, I'm making mine." She nodded, sliding the drive toward her. "I'll start drafting the paperwork. But Mark, this is going to take time. Be prepared for pushback." "I'm ready," I said, though the weight in my chest told me otherwise. But as I drove back to the motel, I realized there was one more thing I needed to do. The business was one thing, but my personal life was another. Jessica had taken something sacred and twisted it. Tyler, my own son, had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. Confronting them together was one thing, but I needed to face them individually. That night, I called Jessica. She picked up after a few rings, her voice hesitant. "Mark? I need to see you," I said, my tone flat. "Where?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Your choice," I said. "But don't make me wait long." We agreed to meet at a quiet bar near the resort. As I walked in and saw her sitting in the corner, her face pale and drawn, I felt a surge of anger mixed with sadness. This was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with my life. And now, she was a stranger. Jessica stood as I approached, her eyes wide with what looked like guilt, or fear. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't. Just sit down." She obeyed, and I took the seat across from her, staring at her for a long moment. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I asked finally. "To me? To us? To our family?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't even know how it started." "Stop lying," I said, my voice hard. "I've seen the emails, the photos, the texts. This wasn't some accidental mistake. You made choices, Jessica. Deliberate, calculated choices." Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it," I said. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She didn't answer right away, and her hesitation felt like another dagger to the heart. "I don't know," she whispered finally. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words pressing down on me. That's all I needed to hear. Mark, please, she said, reaching for my hand. Can we fix this? Can we at least try? I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. Fix this? Jessica, you didn't just cheat on me. You destroyed everything we built together. You and Tyler, you took something sacred and burned it to the ground. Her tears fell harder, but I felt no sympathy. This wasn't about her pain. It was about mine. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, I said coldly. And don't think for a second that I'll let you walk away unscathed. As I left the bar, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, but most of all, determination. Jessica and Tyler thought they could betray me and come out of it unscathed. They were wrong. After the confrontation with Jessica, I felt like I'd taken the first step toward reclaiming some control over the chaos my life had become. But there was still one more confrontation I couldn't avoid, the one with Tyler. Facing him was going to be harder, and not just because of the betrayal. This was my son. The boy I'd raised, protected, and guided through life. He wasn't just a partner in the business, he was part of my legacy, my blood. The thought of seeing him, of having to look him in the eye and acknowledge what he'd done, made my stomach churn. But I couldn't delay it any longer. If I was going to move forward, I needed to confront him. I called Tyler the next morning. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense. Dad? Meet me at the park near the resort, I said flatly. We need to talk. There was a long pause before he replied. Okay. What time? Now. When I arrived at the park, Tyler was already there, sitting on a bench near the water. He looked nervous, his shoulders hunched, and his hands fidgeting in his lap. It was a stark contrast to the confident, charismatic young man I'd always known. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sorrow for what was about to happen. But then I remembered the photos, the texts, and the kiss on the beach, and my resolve hardened. I walked over and sat down next to him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things that needed to be said but couldn't be put into words. Finally, Tyler broke the silence. Dad, I don't know where to start. Try the truth, I said coldly, staring straight ahead at the water. When did it start? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Chicago. The business trip to Chicago. Months ago, I said, my voice laced with bitterness. So, all this time, you've been lying to me. To my face. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said quickly. It just did. I turned to him, my anger boiling over. Stop saying that. Affairs don't just happen, Tyler. You made a choice. She made a choice. Every text, every trip, every moment you spent with her, you both chose this. He looked down, shame written all over his face. I know, Dad. I know I screwed up. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't just hurt me, I said, my voice shaking. You betrayed me. You betrayed everything I thought we had. Do you even understand what you've done? He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I do. Do you love her? I asked, echoing the question I'd asked Jessica the night before. He hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. I don't know, he said finally. It's complicated. I let out a bitter laugh. Complicated? You're sleeping with my wife, Tyler. There's nothing complicated about that. It's betrayal, plain and simple. He didn't respond, and the silence stretched between us. Finally, I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. I trusted you, I said, my voice trembling. I brought you into the business, taught you everything I know, and this is how you repay me. Dad, I'm sorry, he said, standing up as well. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. You can't make this right, I snapped. You and Jessica destroyed everything. The marriage, the family, the business, everything. And now, you're going to have to face the consequences. His face paled. What do you mean? I'm removing you from the agency, I said firmly. You and Jessica. Effective immediately. His eyes widened in shock. You can't do that. I can, and I will, I said. I've already spoken to Emily. The paperwork is in motion. You and Jessica have not only betrayed me personally, but you've also misused company funds. That's grounds for termination, Tyler. And I'll make sure neither of you walks away with a single cent. Dad, please, he said, his voice breaking. This is my career. My future. You should have thought about that before you slept with my wife, I said coldly. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I understand. I stared at him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the son I used to know. But all I saw was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust. This is the last time we'll speak about this, I said finally. From now on, everything goes through my lawyer. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the water. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, relief. But most of all, I felt empty. The family I thought I had, the business I'd worked so hard to build, it was all gone. And now, all I could do was move forward, one painful step at a time. You can hear the continuation of this story in the second part of the video and find out how the fate of this family turned out.